In an age when the fate of nations hung in the balance, one man engineered the thunder. This is the story of Sir Stanley Hooker. From the Spitfire's cry to the Concorde's boom, his engines powered the fastest machines of their time. But his greatest triumph was forged in Britain's darkest hour.
I think my greatest success was the two-stage supercharger on the Merlin. That I did do myself. And I proposed it, I specified it, I did all the calculations, we made it, and it worked first pop. It puts 70 miles an hour on the speed of the Spitfire and 10,000 feet on its fighting altitude. Air Marshal Gordon flew the first one, always tells me about how he soared up past an WWII. He said, I could see the German pilot following me up like that with a look of utter astonishment on his face. So, without any doubt, I think the two-stage Merlin, which was my first real contribution to aviation, was my best.
Stanley was showing by his supercharger technology how to stuff the air through the engine. And the Merlin power was increased from 1,000 horsepower at the beginning of the war to 2,000 at the end of the war. And by these means, the RAF was able to keep ahead of the Germans. If it hadn't been for that work, I don't think the RAF could have won the Battle of Britain.
Stanley Hooker was born in 1907, the son of a Kent farm manager. He was quick to demonstrate a gift for physics and mathematics. By the age of 28, with degrees from Imperial College and Oxford, and in danger of becoming a professional student, he took a scientific job with the Admiralty. But his engineering career came about by chance. By the late 1930s, the Great Rearmament program was underway. Aircraft factories were being built across the country. There were thousands of jobs going on the new production lines, and bright young boffins were needed in the design departments. It was at this time that Stanley Hooker first met Ernest Hives, the formidable boss of Rolls-Royce's Derby factory.
Well, it was in January 1938, early in January 1938. And I remember on one of the usual miserable, cold, dark, damp days, when I walked up Nightingale Road in Derby to be interviewed by Lord Hives over there. And I remember wondering what the hell I was doing there, because I had a very nice job in the scientific research department of the Admiralty at the time. And I went into old Hives' office, and he had all my papers on this very desk. This was the desk in question. And he's thumbing through these because I had a degree in mathematics from London and a doctorate from Oxford, and I'd written quite a lot of theoretical papers on aerodynamics primarily. And he thumbed through all this lot, and he looked at me and he said, "You're not much of an engineer, are you?" I said, "No, I'm not." I had to admit that. He said, "Never mind." He said, we can teach you to be an engineer." And he said, "Who do you work for? Who do you work for?" And I said, "Well, I told him." And he picked up the phone and said to his secretary, "Get me Sir Charles Wright," it was at the time. I thought, good God, I hadn't told the Admiralty I was going there for a job or anything of that kind. And I thought, well, he's going to cut the ground from under my feet now, and he did too. He rang this fellow up, and they had a conversation on the phone, and he put down, he said, "Well, he says you're a dirty dog because he's just promoted you." He said, "But we can have you if we want to." When I arrived, they led me through this hurricane of activity that went on in Rolls-Royce, telephones ringing, typewriters clapping, great big drawing boards and that sort of thing, to a little office with glass partitioned office, opened the door and there was an empty desk and a bookcase and a telephone and a chair. And they said, "This is your office, cheerio," and he left me. And of course I sat there all day and did nothing. Next day the same thing happened. Third day I took the Times in with me and took my pipe and started to smoke, because smoking was forbidden, except between 10:30 and 11 in those days. But I started to smoke in the morning, and people came up to me and do that. I thought, oh, the hell with you, nothing else to do. So I went on smoking. And eventually I got tired of this, and I went out of the office into the next office, where there were a lot of young men, all busy as hell with drawings and calculations and so forth. And over in the corner was a very quiet old boy, grey-haired, and sitting rather active. It was after lunch. I think he was asleep, actually, sitting like this. And I went over to him and I said, "What do you do?" And he said, I'm in charge of supercharger testing." So I said, "What's that mean?" Well, he said, we put a supercharger on an electric motor rig, and we test it, and we measure the pressure and the airflow and all these characteristics. He said, and here's the results. And he showed me. I said, well, can I have one of those curves? And he said, oh, have the lot, like that. See? So I went away to my office with this bunch of data, which was meat to me because I'd been trained to handle the flow of air and pressures and temperatures and so forth. And I analysed all this lot and came to the conclusion that there'd got to be certain changes made in the compressor if it was, although I'd never seen one at that stage. I'd never seen an aero engine close to or a supercharger, but one could deduce what the diffuser efficiency was, the rotary efficiency and so on. And I did this and I wrote a report. And I didn't hear anything about it, and I passed it to the chief engineer who looked at it and said, oh, this is very interesting, I must pass this to Mr. Eller, who was the chief experimental engineer. And about a week later, old Eller burst into my office. I was just going home. I should leave at 5 on the dot with nothing else to do. And he waved this thing at me. He said, did you write this? I said, yes. So I thought, good God, what happened now? He said, well, you're in charge of superchargers. And that's how I got my first job. Well, the day after war was declared, a Monday, was the usual day in which Hives held his great technical survey of the position of the Merlin engine, principally at that time. And I remember him coming in to the meeting, sitting down and looking at it all and saying, now we're in this war and we've got to win it. No good being a good second. And he immediately set about the usual agenda for the afternoon. Of course, Rolls-Royce were already set up by Hives to double their output overnight. It meant the men had got to work a lot harder, of course, but the machine tools and the materials and everything were there, ready for that. In fact, the men worked 18 hours a day for 7 days a week when the war started, because every engine that fought in the Battle of Britain was actually made at the works at Derby. There was no other factory in the country producing Merlin engines at the time.
The atmosphere at Derby in 1940 was intense because the war was on the go, and the engines that we had in the Hurricane and Spitfire, Rolls-Royce engines, were smaller than the German engines, and we therefore had to produce as much, if not more, power than the Germans from a smaller engine, and that meant a more high degree of development.
And so we were able to advance the power of the Merlin all through the war steadily, from 1,000 horsepower to 2,000 horsepower, without basically changing the engine. It still went into the Lancasters and the Hurricanes and the Spitfires, the Mosquitoes, no basic change. Whereas the Germans had departed and built the Focke-Wulf 190 with a great lumbering air-cooled engine in it. Brute force and bloody ignorance, I called it at the time, I remember. And we were all obsessed by the idea that we were going to keep the Merlin ahead of the Germans. And we did too.
By the summer of 1940, the piston-engine fighters were flying in the Battle of Britain, while on the ground, in a disused foundry, a top-secret design was being developed, Frank Whittle's jet engine. But his radical idea had few supporters. One of them was Stanley Hooker.
And I had several times tried to persuade old Hives to go and see this engine. And he said to me, you know, what does it do? And I said, well, it gives 1,000 pounds of thrust. He said, 1,000 pounds of thrust? He said, what's the use of that? So that wouldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding, would it?
But Hooker knew the power was there. He would prove to Hives that Frank Whittle's jet was worth investigating.
And so on the Sunday, he picked me up in his car and we drove down and we saw Whittle's engine running. And old Hyde went round without any comment, very much comment, and Whittle was telling him all about the engine, the advantages and so forth. And at the end of it, old Hyde looked at Whittle and he said, I can't see many engines about here, Whittle. He said, where are they all? And Frank Whittle said, well, I've only got 2, you know. He said, I can't get the parts made. So old Hyde said to him, send us the drawings, we'll make bits for you. And we did.
But the Ministry of Aircraft Production had already chosen the Rover Motorcar Company to make the early Whittle engines. By 1942, though, Rover's management and Whittle were barely speaking. Hooker heard about the conflict and told Hives, who began to plot. He wanted to make that remarkable jet engine. And he did.
And one day old Hive said to me, come on, we're going to have dinner with S.B. Wilkes, the chairman of Rovers, at Clitheroe tonight. So away I went with him. I didn't know what was going to happen. We had a nice dinner. The fried bob won, but being Yorkshire, you get a bit over the odds, you know. And we had a very nice dinner. When dinner was over, old Hives turned to Wilson and said, "No, look," he said, "Wilson, what are you doing with this jet engine?" He said, "I hear you're not getting on with this chap Whittle." And old Will said, "No, we're finding him very difficult." So Hives said, "Well, you shouldn't be doing that engine, should you? You're not an aero engine company. You grub about on the ground," I remember him saying. And he said, "I'll tell you what I'll do." He said, "I'll give you our tank engine factory at Nottingham. You give me this jet job up here." And old Will said, "Done, I should be jolly glad to be shot of the job." And that's how we got Barnoldswick and the development, and we became responsible for the production of jet engines.
We were mostly young men. Even Stanley Hooker himself would only be 35 or 6 at that time, and he was the boss. I myself was 30. We had a complete carte blanche to do almost what we wanted with regard to modifying the engines. If we thought up some new way of constructing it that could be done without too much manufacturing, we used to get tests done overnight, and we'd have tested them in the next day. If it required manufacturing, we had all the resources of Rolls-Royce to call on to get casting, sheet metal work, and that sort of thing. And so we could do quite advanced things in a matter of weeks.
Few believed the jet would be powerful enough, but Hooker and his team proved the doubters wrong when the Meteor jet became the first plane fast enough to shoot down a flying bomb in 1944.
We went on developing the engine, and then we were told by the ministry to design an engine of 4,000 pounds of thrust, which is a big step up, twice the thrust. And I was sent to America about that time, because we had great collaborations with the Americans. We told them everything we were doing. And they even had a Whittle engine. He gave them an engine. And to my horror, when I got there, I found they were already running an engine at 4,000 pounds of thrust, or close to. The General Electric company were. And so when I came back, I said, "To hell with this 4,000, let's design it for 5. And we rang up, I remember ringing up the ministry, George Watt, and Group Captain George Watt was in charge. I said, "Look, George, we're forgetting 4,000, we're going for 5,000. He said, "OK," and that was all we had to do in those days. Now it would take a year to get a thing agreed like that. We started it in January 1945. We had it running by the middle of the year, and we took the world speed record in October the same year. It was the first aeroplane ever to exceed 600 miles an hour, the Meteor.
We were improving rapidly a new breed of engine. We also began to see that it would revolutionize air transport altogether, not just as a fighter engine, but in transport aircraft and everything. And I would have thought that Stanley Hooker was one of the first people to see that this would be so.
The Rolls-Royce workshops at Derby have been producing air record-breaking engines for almost 20 years. It is here that the famous Derwent jet engines are made. Engines that can hurl a plane through space at a speed where the normal smooth flow of air breaks down into a series of violent shock waves.
But a shock wave of the personal sort lay ahead for Hooker. One of his projects, the Avon, went wrong, and he quarrelled with his mentor, Hives.
He said, "There's too much hanging on the fate of this Avon engine for me to leave it up here in this damn garage." He said, "This isn't Rolls-Royce, you know," he called it a garage. "This isn't Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce at Derby, I'm going to take it there." And I said, "What are you going to do with me then?" He said, "I think I'm going to send you home for 3 months." So I said, "Well, that's a fine return for 11 years hard work with you." I remember saying that to him. He said, "I don't care about that." He said, "You go home." He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "What's your address?" I said, "Well, I'm not going to tell you." He said, "Well, how can I get in touch with you?" And I said, "Well, you can't get in touch with me." I said, "If you want to get in touch with me, you ring my bank." I said, "But I'll tell you one thing, if you send me home, I'll never work in a factory controlled by you again." And so we parted like that at Barnoldswick. And I must say, it was a very miserable and traumatic day for me.
the Rolls-Royce gas turbine team at Barnelswick under Hooker had been enormously successful, of course, and one thought of Hooker as, after Whittle, as the most important gas turbine engineer in England, probably in the world. And when the Avon got into serious trouble and brought back to Derby, it was a bit of a shock to us that Hooker was given a comparatively small job.
Hives had persuaded Hooker to return and head Derby's research team. But the new job fell lamentably short of what Hooker had expected.
Hives had always promised me, he had promised me that I should be chief engineer of Rolls-Royce, you know. And by this time I was about 40, and I thought it was time I was made chief engineer of Rolls-Royce. Not like today, where, you know, at 50 you're a promising young engineer in Rolls-Royce. But in those days, I thought I was in charge of a turbine job when I was about 30, and by the time I hit 40, I thought I was ready to take over the whole damn firm.
But Hooker resigned instead. The Bristol Aeroplane Company was expanding into jet production and badly needed Hooker's expertise. Bristol had run into serious problems with the engine design of their new passenger plane, the Britannia. If they didn't get it right, and quickly, the company would collapse. Hooker's first job was to redesign the troublesome turboprop engine.
It was a time when I felt responsibility very heavily, because I felt I was the only man in the company who had any real experience of jet engines.
In the engine school, Dr. Stanley Hooker, the chief engineer, talks to flight crews from the Royal Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force, and the Canadian Pacific Airlines.
For more and more horsepower. And so it is to the turbine engine over here that we have to turn for the lift pump. These are the basic casings of the engine, opened up for your inspection, and over here we have the inside components which really produce the power.
Hooker ran Bristol's engine team in the exhilarating years when the government spent freely on new fighter and bomber projects. When the mighty Vulcan, the flying dart, needed an engine, Hooker was determined to make one more powerful than anything his old Rolls-Royce colleagues could achieve.
I remember sending out a Christmas card. We were very proud of this engine. It was the most powerful engine in the world at the time. Very proud of it. And we had a picture of Mount Olympus on one side, and Mount Olympus 9,750 feet. Picture of the Olympus engine on the other side. Olympus engine 9,750 pounds of thrust, you see. I sent this out, and I sent it to some of my pals in Rolls-Royce. One of them wrote back to me and said, "How does the weight compare?"
In 1958, the most expensive ever aircraft was ordered, TSR-2, designed around the successful Olympus engine, the world's first strike and reconnaissance plane. The Air Ministry demanded constant changes. Frustration mounted on both sides as delays and wrangling blew costs up to an all-time high.
I remember saying to Geoffrey Tuttle when he was Vice Chief of the Air Staff, when they demanded 1,000 miles of radius of operation for the TSR-2, I met Geoffrey Tuttle one day on an airfield, and I said, "Geoffrey, why 1,000 miles? I said, "It sounds like a number just conjured out of the air." He said, "'Tis." He said, "It's an objective, 1,000 miles." I said, "Well, that will cost you £1 million a mile. For the last 150 miles will cost you £1 million a mile." Well, that was an underestimate, I guess, too.
Within a few years, the TSR-2 had made its first flight and was regarded as a fighter of brilliant performance. Then, in 1965, with stunning suddenness, it was scrapped.
There was old Sands white paper in 1958 which said, "We're finished with man-piloted aircraft. We're going to have missiles. Press the button. No more men." So men were out. Then the Americans cancelled the missile, which was it? Blue Streak or something. Yeah, they cancelled that. So we had no missiles, no manned aircraft. Old Thornycroft arrived on the scene, or Lord Thornycroft arrived on the scene, rather. And he said, "Well, I haven't got any airplanes, I haven't got any missiles on the stock. I'll order some more airplanes." So he ordered the supersonic vertical takeoff airplane, the Armstrong Siddeley airplane, the TSR-2, etc. Old Healy came along, so manned airplanes were back in again. Old Healy came along and said, "We can't afford all that lot. We'll buy F-111s on tick." So manned airplanes red again. So in a period of a few years, we were in, we were out, we were in, we were out. You know, it's more like a boat race than a policy to follow.
Hooker's highest hope for the Olympus now rode with a supersonic airliner, Concorde. But it took 18 years development, with constant threats of cancellation, before Concorde made its first scheduled flight in 1976. Through those years of controversy, first over TSR-2, then Concorde, Hooker had been quietly developing another extraordinary aircraft engine for the first vertical takeoff fighter, the jump jet Harrier.
We had this engine, but of course there was no aeroplane anywhere on the stocks that I knew of to take it. And I must say we didn't push it all that much either, because I wasn't really absolutely convinced that it wasn't funny, you know, myself. And we were very heavily involved in TSR-2 at the time. But I got a letter from Sidney Cam which said, "Dear Hooker, what are you doing about vertical takeoff? Yours, Sidney." Sidney Cam was the chief designer of Hawkers. They'd made all the RAF fighters from way back in the 1930s, the Hart, the Fury, the Demon, etc., the Hunter, the Hurricane. And so I sent him a copy of our project brochure for the Pegasus, you see? And then forgot about that too. And a few weeks later, the telephone rang, and it was Sidney on the other end, and of course he was a very irate character, or could be, or made out to be. He said, "When are you going to see me, Hooker?" He said. So I said, "Well, I'll come any time." So I said, "What's the subject?" He said, "The subject," he said, "I've got an aeroplane round your engine." I said, "Which engine?" He said, "The vertical take engine, you fool, you know." So of course up I went, and there I saw a picture of the P1127, which is just like the Harrier, and there was the Pegasus engine installed in it. I said to Sidney when we first put it in, "I suppose you're going to do some conventional flying," because the aeroplane could be used conventionally. All you had to do was point the nozzle back, and it was just a normal aeroplane. "I suppose you're going to do some conventional flying first, didn't he?" He said, "What for?" I said, "Well, you know, just to make sure the aeroplane is a nice aeroplane and everything under control." "All right," he said, "the Hawker aeroplanes are always beautiful." He said, "There's nothing wrong with the Hawker aeroplane, not going to bother with that. It's vertical first time." And they tethered it on the end of a piece of string, you know. And the result was that when it took off, it went zzz, like you know, all over the place, and it was very, very difficult.
The all-British Harrier went on to become an international success. Hooker had believed in it from the beginning. His support never wavered. It was his tenacity that kept the project alive.
The world, Derby, America, the rest of the world have spent a mint of money trying to make a VTOL fighter, and not one of them has succeeded. It's still the supreme solution as a VTOL fighter.
The ultimate test of the Harrier's prowess came in the Falklands War, long after Stanley Hooker had retired. But without Stanley Hooker, there would have been no Pegasus engine and no Harrier. And without the jump jet, there would have been no task force victory. In 1967, Hooker retired to his country home near Bristol. By this time, his former employer, Rolls-Royce, had taken over the Bristol firm and was a main pillar of the British aircraft industry. But in 1971, the unthinkable happened. Rolls-Royce couldn't pay its bills. Edward Heath's government moved swiftly to prevent total collapse. They bought the company, except for the RB211 jet engine that had caused Rolls-Royce's downfall. So Stanley Hooker was brought out of retirement as the one man who could convince the government that the RB211 was worth saving.
The morale of the whole outfit, of the engineers particularly, had, sunk to its lowest possible ebb. And there was a tendency to blame one another, I think he ought to be sacked, or he ought to be sacked, and so forth, And also I found that the first 11 wasn't necessarily working on the engine, which was a disaster. And so the first job I had to do was to try to get more people, better people working on the engine.
Hooker was back at the helm, responsible for the success or failure of the RB211 program. He brought in his trusted colleagues from the old days. Among them, Harry Pearson.
He had an enormous influence on the position. He put everybody's courage back. They began to lose heart. He restored that. And it was so typical of the man. He didn't find fault with anything. He just got down to it and made a wonderful engine, and what was potentially a good engine anyway.
I think if the RB211 had failed totally, it would be a terrible setback for British high-technology engineering. And Stanley came back from retirement. He took a grip of the engine and the engineers. He directed them, and he got it right.
The motivating thing is to make a good engine, a powerful engine, the best engine, reliable engine, not to kill anybody and so on. That's the motivating thing. And most engineers bend their life to that task.
But times had changed from Hooker's early days, when it was the engineer whose word ruled. When he retired in 1978, accountants were in command.
And we used to start an engine by saying, well, what's the engine got to do? That much. How long does it take us to draw it? That much. How long it takes to make the first experimental engines? How much testing have we got to do? When can they put it into production? And how much will it cost? So we start with, is it any damn good? That was number one question. No, it's the other way around. How much is the damn thing going to cost? When do we put it in production? How many development engines are we going to have? How long is it going to take us to design it? The last question seems to be, is it any damn good? It's all gone round the other way.
Well, Einstein was a great mathematician, a genius. I always thought that Stanley was a near genius. He was very, very clever and a very good engineer. And very clever, very good engineers are very difficult to find. You don't get too many in a generation or in a country.
The roar of the Merlin may eventually fade, but the legacy of Sir Stanley Hooker, a relentless pursuit of power and perfection, forever changed the skies. He was a true titan of engineering.